Hey everyone.
Hello there. So today's episode is basically like I've been wanting to do this for a long time. Every time we post things, not every time, but often when we post things to Instagram, I think like my former self would laugh her ass off at this, like what I'm doing now. Like so many of the things that we do back in the day when we were doing like regular strength and conditioning stuff would be like I guess like a tablecloth episode as we
They may not get the tablecloth reference, but that was a friend of ours who would say when they would see something in the gym that looked bad, we just put a tablecloth over it so you could look the other way and forget about it.
right.
That's the tablecloth reference.
Yeah.
Sean
Yeah.
Gower.
But yeah, so anyways, but then it just keeps coming up as well because you know inevitably, like if you're not doing the same old standard shit that everybody else is doing fitness wise, you get the hecklers, and we had a pretty decent one yesterday. Well, Grayson did, but um, so anyways, we just thought we would talk about that because it is kind of funny, like how uh,
It's just that thing. It's easy to be judgy about stuff that you don't know about, or you have your perceived ideas of this is what training looks like, and when you see things outside of that,
or you just get taught that it's going to hurt you. You know,
that
like
too.
that's the education in that whatever that camp, which is funny because like it kind of takes itself, it is taken it upon itself to become the authority on exercise, like strength and conditioning, personal trainer certification type stuff, where it's like this is the correct form, these are the correct exercises. We don't do any of these exercises anymore because they've been deemed unsafe and likely to hurt somebody. Um, and like point and laugh at anybody that's doing anything.
Shame them into conforming.
Right, like if you're rounding your back, like oh my god, holy shit, his back is rounded and he's like pulling something heavy off the ground. Um, they're just some major faux pas type things, like that. Oh, we just don't do those things anymore because they're bad for your joints.
It's funny because I think anybody who's been in this world long enough of training people and just working with bodies all the time and people who have issues is, if that's your belief, you start to have lots of questions about it though, because maybe you've gone through that personally, or you have clients who are like, I did it with good form, I did the right things, I braced my torso, and I still hurt my back when I bent over. And you start to wonder, like, well, why is there this huge emphasis on all this stuff and people are still getting hurt? I always wondered why my back would go out when I was maintaining a perfect neutral spine and I was doing stuff.
Well, and the excuse is, which is it's a good excuse, but it because it's true in some ways, but it also doesn't fit to be true always. And if it starts to become a recurrent pattern, then you have to really start to question this excuse. But the excuse is, well, you can't 100% prevent injury all the time, which you can't. But when you start having a sneaky suspicion that the shit that you're having people do is making it worse, like some people that have been training with you for a while and their shoulder problem really isn't going away, you're kind of avoiding the shoulder problem more than you're um, training to address the shoulder problem. You just basically pull a bunch of movements away from the person and say you're just not going to be able to do these, like you can't XYZ. um, and then the rehab isn't really ideal, like it's not really targeted. And then well, how far do I want to tangent on this one? Oh, the rehab often skips like the glaring issue of capsule and joint space, which is like this big thing that is part of what we focus more on now. It's a bigger feature of this system that we're using now than it has been in anything else I've ever done. But it's important. Like you can't deny that it's important. It might irritate people because it's buzzwordy at this point, but like your joint capsule is your joint capsule. If your joint capsule doesn't have space and it's jacked up, like you have to address it, and how are you addressing it? How do you assess it? How do you address it? Anyways, so that's kind of how we got to where we are today, is because we were trying to train people and make them feel better, make their bodies work better, and we were just noticing that these things that we were doing, it's like, well, but why is this so good? Like you just start to question it, like what's so infallible about this system? And for me, like the biggest like aha moment, and honestly, like it's such a stupid thing to have assumed going up to this that it's almost embarrassing that I never really thought about that. But Like if you take 75 people in a class, relatively new people, and you teach them all the exact same movement for their hips, like a squat. I always use the squat. Um, you can't really expect to 2 years down the road have all 75 people have the same outcome from doing that same exact squat. Like they have all different hips going into it. So some of the people that you have set off down this course are going to lose a dramatic amount of precious capsule space that they didn't even have to begin with. They won't have a hip that rotates at all anymore. They're going to have back problems. They're going to have hip problems. They've probably been squatting way deeper than they ever deserve to be. Even parallel for a lot of people is way more. You're trying to train and strengthen resisting hip flexion, but you're some people, they're done so much farther than parallel that then you're training their back in a weird way. Even if it looks flat, it still is a lot of tension going into that person's back. So anyways, it's not going to have the same effect on everybody. And what I'm talking about is that assessing the body that you're training and then loading that body, rather than trying to plug everybody into this exercise form, and this exercise form is going to fix things. It's not. It's like going to make things worse for a lot of people.
It's hard because that's a model that's applied in lots of places, like rehab. Like a very classic form of physical therapy is like you have a shoulder injury, and so you go in to see your physical therapist, and you get handed a sheet that has 10 exercises on it for a shoulder injury, and you're just supposed to start doing these injuries and exercises. Yeah, sorry, injuries. I have injuries on my brain. And that's not to knock PTs at all, because there's different PTs doing different stuff, but that's kind of the classic model that I work with a lot of people who've done their PT exercises and they haven't seen improvement. It's not that everybody doesn't have improvement. It's kind of like that room of 75 people squatting. There are going to be some people in there that get better at squatting and do really well with it and feel good, and those are probably people that are starting with different levels of hip joint space and some other things that you really need a good foundation of to improve upon. Now, granted, if you never train that stuff, it is going to go away over time, just like everything else. If you do strength training and then you stop for a long time, you lose some strength. It works the same way with your joint space and other aspects, but it's just this idea of like these standard templates that get applied for all kinds of things, strength and athletic performance and rehab. There's just the standardized thing, and like the biggest step that is missed, and something that we never really thought about, but makes so much fucking sense when you go through FRC and you realize, like, look at this person that you're going to work with. What stuff do they have right now? What anatomy do they have? And then basing all your decisions on that. Like, that makes the most sense. That's what should be happening for any kind of physical training. It doesn't matter what the fuck you want to do. You got to look at what the current parts are.
And it also, like, it kind of, I guess in some ways it kind of looks at it from two different perspectives. And one perspective is that the people that are prescribing these fixative, one-size-fits-all
Fixative
courses for people, right, sticks to them. They're basically like making the assumption or operating on the assumption that the exercise is going to fix that person, and that like a squat, for example, is going to give that person better hips, or the split, or whatever it is, whatever exercise that you're training. It's like, this is going to make this person better, and we're going to use this exercise to develop range of motion that this person doesn't have, and you don't need to stretch or anything like that, because if you squat, you're going to develop better hip flexion and all this stuff. And it's like, and to some extent that may be true, and for some people that may be true, but it also depends on, like, there are more variables going into that situation. And so it's a kind of a broad pass filter that does help people. Like, it's not to say that, like, doing classical strength and conditioning and following that good form, everybody's getting fucked up by it. Like, that's not what I'm saying at all. Obviously, that's not the case. But a lot more people are getting fucked up by it than need to be, purely because there isn't an assessment, and the system is also missing a huge block of training that looks at those deeper tissues like capsule and rotation. So that stuff is being completely neglected. Connective tissue is being completely neglected. It gets touched accidentally rather than intentionally. And so some people go into that system and they have enough space and they have enough stuff to have that little system progress them the way that they want to. But what we have found is that a more logistical and for us appropriate way to do that training is to really assess what we're dealing with before we start throwing things at people, and then find a movement that suits how that person needs to move, limit other movements that they want to do that they're not quite ready for, and say all you have to do is just not try to go ass to grass and you'll be okay. You're good with parallel, or you're really not good with parallel. You should try some kind of a split squat first or something like that. Like there's just different things that work for different people, and that's the key takeaway there, is learning how to assess, learning how to help people assess. But then kind of where we're going with this also is that because of that, it's not that there is this series of like NASM approved exercises that's going to be right and perfect for everyone and that's going to fit the bill. There's not like a series of FRC exercises that's right and perfect for everyone. The whole frustrating / beautiful thing about FRC, Kinstretch, functional range systems, is that it's you come up with the thing to train the tissue. You come up with the exercise. Like it doesn't, a named exercise is going to miss the mark too much. You need to make it more specific and target that stuff. But a lot of the times those exercises look weird as shit and they get you flack on Instagram or whatever, because it's like, this person needs to develop spine flexion. They don't have spine flexion. So how do you develop spine flexion? You start off with basic like training in motor skill awareness, like being able to move and control and sense that, but then also with stretching. Stretching load is a lot easier to control than throwing somebody right into a Jefferson curl. So if you just start saying, do some Jefferson curls, like you could do that, and yes, it does develop and strengthen spine flexion, but if the person doesn't have it, it's probably not the best go-to. So that's again where we find certain things where people get very confused about, like, this exercise is going to be good for developing this, and it can develop it, but it's, in my opinion, a better expression of a position that you have. So a Jefferson curl is a great example. Like if you have developed spine flexion, then you start loading and training the spine flexion with something like a Jefferson curl. If you have good spine flexion, if you have a good awareness of where your back is in space and how to control the flexion extension that you do have, how to not like prop yourself up on your bones in like deep end range and then load the hell out of that, that's probably not a great idea for anybody. But if you have a lot of flexion and you can control it and you can go heavy through certain percentages of that flexion, that's a safe exercise for that person at that point. They've gotten to the point where they can load that. Then they're strengthening their back rather than avoiding the position that they need to train desperately. Like just doing neutral spine all the time. If somebody doesn't have a back that moves, strengthening neutral spine is not going to give them a back that moves. It's not going to improve the health of their spine. So.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I was making mental notes while you were talking. One of those things you said earlier on of like, it's not like classic.
Might be real squishy with the microphone there with your elbow.
I didn't touch it though, I don't think. As far as like, not everybody is gonna fall apart from. I think Lily's knocking on the door. Not everybody's gonna fall apart doing traditional training, at least right away. Like people obviously get stronger and they do better with it. And you said it's not going to hurt everybody, and I totally agree with that. Although I think the one thing that's important to mention is like, if you extend that timeline long enough and all you're doing is standard strength training, you are going to have problems at some point. Like I have not worked with an individual at this point who has done only strength training, classic strength training for a long time and not had problems with it at some point. And it may not happen until your 30s or 40s or whatever, but again, it's just because you're prioritizing some stuff, but not all the stuff that you need to do that. So anyway, that was just one thing I wanted to reiterate there.
Well, I bet if you looked at that individual too, that would have been somebody like those people that intuitively did better at CrossFit because they understood how to take breaks from certain things and how to cycle. You know, and they're like, CrossFit worked great for me, but when you really ask them how they did it, it's like they didn't actually go.
They weren't just
do a hero WOD every day. You know, like they weren't doing that.
Right.
So like these people, that there's got to be somebody out there that's done classic strength and conditioning for their whole lifespan and was totally fine, but they probably also did incorporate some weirdo rotational training movements or some other things, in there stretching, like different stuff that wasn't just following a pure strength and conditioning and nothing else.
Totally. I mean, this is some anecdotal, just based on people that I work with and see, and other friends who do this stuff, who do FRC training. We talk about this stuff, but there's like a strong camp of people out there who are like, you don't need to do joint specific work. Like, that's a waste of time. If you just do full range of motion movement, you're going to be fine. And that's going to resolve all of the issues that you might have. And it's interesting because a lot of those people I do see who are saying that move really well and they have really good range of motion. But I think a lot of that comes down to, like, it's hard to be outside of your own reality. Like, if you have really good shoulder rotation and you do overhead squats, it's easy to think that the overhead squats are the thing that gave you really good shoulder rotation. But if you take a different individual who has terrible shoulder rotation and you just keep having them do overhead squats, it doesn't get better. It often makes their shoulders feel worse. Like, I absolutely had that experience training my own shoulders. So I think it's also hard there's that argument out there of like, just do full range of motion and it resolves everything. And in my opinion, I think the only thing that it really resolves are for the people who already have a good baseline of that stuff. And there probably is a component of, like, if you have a lot of those deeper qualities of joint space and you do those full range of motion movements, it probably does a better job of maintaining them somewhat, but it's not enough to build more of them.
But I think also, though, in some ways, though, it's right. They're just neglecting the rotational aspect. Like, it's like, let's do full range linear movements, and that's enough. Like, full range linear movement is enough to target internal rotation of the hip, and it's like, it really isn't. Like, you're targeting a percentage of it, but not all of it. And I think we touched on this in one of these last episodes, but there's like, people get so hyper focused on the ultimate way to train your glutes, like, what's the very best exercise? Like, is it a squat? Is it a hip thrust? Is it a step up? Like, and everybody's butt's a little different is really what it comes down to. But you're so obsessed about this, and like other things too, like you have to stretch a muscle, you have to go through that full range, like that's the story. Great, but this rotate too, like that's all it is really. It's like, there's rotation, like that's how you're targeting your capsules and your rotators, is like deep end range. That's how you target your connective tissue, is with end range. So it's so in some senses it's right, but it's also like, but don't think that this linear movement is going to optimally then also target your rotators. Like, they're two different things. You gotta go this way and this way.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. But then also just this, like the loading thing. That's the other thing, the thing that I see all the time, that the stuff that drives me crazy now is not somebody rounding their back. It's not somebody doing some weird reactive catches, stuff that looks funny, jumping into, like a lot of the stuff that you do, like a lot of people are like, oh, this is going to blow up my rotator cuff. And it's like, well, yeah, if you just take somebody that has never trained that tissue at all and then have them do that, yeah, you don't throw somebody into an advanced rotator cuff training exercise and expect it to go well. Like, there's a process to getting to that point.
Well, it's all that stuff. That's why people comment on a Zercher deadlift, where you're pulling from the floor with your elbows and your back is in flexion and you're lifting a lot of weight. And people are like, oh my God, that would kill my back. And it's like, it would kill my back too, if I did it at the wrong point in my life, because there were times when that did blow my back up.
Right.
It's like,
what's funny to me though is that there's this big disconnect with people where like they get that, but then you're like, so if I've trained my back to be able to do this and to be strong doing this and to have it not bother me at all, like it feels good, it's great, where's the problem here? Like, why is that bad that I've trained my back to be able to do this so that it doesn't hurt me? Like, that's the thing that's funny to me, is that people can't answer that question. They're kind of like, oh, I don't know, at some point it's going to be bad.
Well, it's like so many things that once you get them in your head, those get set in there, and it's really hard to change your perspective. Even when it's totally reasonable information that makes sense, you're like, yeah, I still feel like it's not going to be good. I mean, if we're not talking about the other joints, I would say the information that's out there and probably the most recognized about the spine is predominantly that flexion and extension wears your spine out like a bearing with no lubrication. Like, that is portrayed as like this magical part of your body that doesn't repair itself. It doesn't have blood flow. There's all these, I don't know what you want to call them, like evolutionary weaknesses, and it's this really fragile thing, which is like a total misunderstanding of biology. But I think there's a lot of voices out there that have a lot of reach that are putting this out there, that it's hard to get past that when you see somebody training their spine. Even if you're like, I've been training my spine like this for the last 6 years. I say so. I mean, I've had arguments with people, not too many because it sucks my soul, but like, you know, like somebody was talking shit about me rounding my back under load. And I said, well, I totally understand that. I know what the classic advice is. I've spent 6 years preparing my spine to do this. And I used to have a lot of back problems when I rounded it. Now it feels really good to do this. And to me, that's a reasonable response. But the answer that I got back was like, oh, you think you know more than the research that's out there? Like, you're an asshole. Like, they totally disregard the fact that you've prepared yourself to do this. And so, you know, I think
and there
there's
just isn't enough research out there, and most of the research
Totally.
is on dead pig spines anyway. So it's like,
Right.
it shouldn't count for anything. But there's, you know, you have to kind of think about things as like, well, what are your options? Your options are don't do anything, just let, you know, entropy take you away. Bad option, right? That's not a good option. There's just do all the wacky shit that you see on the internet with zero prep, and obviously that's not going to go well. Even if it's a straight back deadlift, you know, it's like still you have to even prepare for that. Like, you don't just throw a new person into a class and say, max out your deadlift, don't round your back, you'll be fine. Like, there's a whole lot that goes into preparing tissues to do things, even if they are in like what people deem to be a safer zone. Or, you know, or you can prepare to do these safe exercises where you have a back that's a completely flat stick, that's a very strong stick, but that bends horribly. Or you can train a back to bend well. You can train a back to be very bendy and flexible and bend well, which I have done without really strengthening those ranges of motion. Or you can train a back to be very bendy and be very strong at being bendy. And I have to tell you, the difference is vast.
Substantial.
Yeah. Like, a bendy, sketchy ass back is bad. I mean, it's about as bad as a stiff stick of a back. Like, it's
Totally.
been because those structures aren't supported and they're running into each other, and there is precious stuff inside of the spine that doesn't need to be, you know, tested that way. But having it be supported and then having it do what it's supposed to do, which clearly it's made to move. It's a series of joints. It's not a femur. So that's the best option, clearly, is to train it to be better at what it does, which is move. Like, make sure it's not running into itself, make sure it's supported. And yes, with everything with your body, there's a overtime wear and tear thing. Like, there's only so much movement a joint has. At a certain point, the stuff starts to wear out, you know, so you don't want to just endlessly, you know, Grayson's not Jefferson curling in the basement, you know, 6 days a week. Like,
No.
he does it enough to maintain the strength that he wants out of it, and that's it, you know, to be able to do what he wants to do otherwise.
Yeah.
Does he need to have a 600-pound Jefferson curl? Probably not, you know.
My ego thinks I do. That's a whole other psychological episode that we should probably have.
And then there's that, you know, like, where's the change up there? Like, where is the trade-off between, okay, now you're strong enough to the point now where maybe it is at some point going to be detrimental. I have no idea what that is, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that is, I don't know if anybody knows that answer. Like, how far can you keep pushing tissue to be resilient? I mean, it's not like...
It's probably different person to person, too.
I'm sure, totally, yeah. And I'm sure there is an upper limit of where something will not adapt, maybe without, I don't know, drug use and other stuff to help it. And then even at that point, there's going to be a ceiling somewhere. I mean, I can say for my own training, like, I've progressed it to a point of doing things that I wouldn't think would have been possible without lots of injuries or lots of problems outside of it. So I don't think I'm there yet, but I mean, you know, then it just comes down to like, how much time do you fucking want to spend training? Like, do you want to just live your life where you train 4 or 5 hours a day forever? Like, I'm less interested in doing that now than I used to be. So now it's more so like find the balance of like push the limits of strength and satisfy my ego and, you know, still live my life and do other stuff.
Well, you would do
outside
that
of
if you didn't have all this work and parenting.
Work, yeah, totally.
to do.
Right. But that's not realistic. Going back to like the, you know, all of the advice on what is safe and what isn't safe, I think a lot of that also just comes down to like the society that you live in, you know, like in certain societies, people just squat all the time and they're in deep ass squats with their back rounded and they move and feel great, you know, and there's probably way less stuff out there of being told that like that's bad for your knees to keep them bent for that long or keep your back rounded and stuff like that. I mean, it's funny.
Yeah.
Like,
well, I think those cultures are also probably not, you know,
obsessed with
needing to
training.
exercise as much. Yeah, I mean, like,
Yeah.
then it's probably still pretty funny that people run and things like that. But
Yeah, totally. What really drives me crazy though is, I mean, especially now after just being in this little bubble of training people this way for so long now, is like how easily people disregard like evolution and like the amount of time and selection and force that happened over millions of years to get us a spine that bends, and then just to be like, you know what, that's really dangerous, you should just never move that again. Like that just, it's fucking offensive as far as like what it took to get us a spine with
well, I
all
mean,
these
even
bones to
without
move.
evolution, like even if you just look at a spine and like had to take a multiple choice, your life depends on the answer. Should this shit move or not? You know, I mean, come on, like. How many people out there would select no, it shouldn't move, like without any exercise experience, without having been, you know, having it beaten over your head with a stick that the spine isn't supposed to move, but it's like blatantly obvious, like
Yeah,
it moves, it should move.
yeah, totally.
I don't know. I mean, I think that like some of the stuff that we, what are some of your worst like things that you when you post, you're like, oh, this is gonna light people up.
Well, spine flexion is probably the number one thing. Like loaded spine flexion, especially doing like Zurcher Jefferson curls against the wall or something. I know people are going to get really offended or tell me I'm an asshole for spreading misinformation or whatever. The old time lifts, you know, like bent press, super heavy bent press, or like the Kelly snatch. If you don't know what the Kelly snatch is, you should Google it. It's basically snatching behind your back where you do a forward fold and hoist the weight up over you. That one gets hilarious reactions. Like, I had somebody tell me,
You're gonna rip your shoulders off.
We're gonna rip your shoulders off. But I had one person was like, "You are the epitome of why the internet's bad, making stuff up and showing it this way." And I was like, "This is actually was a contested lift at one point. Like people competed in the Kelly snatch, but whatever." Yeah, those ones are big ones. I mean, even now, I mean, like with all of the camps that are training wise, like. I post something about doing shoulder cars and why joint specific training is really good, and I know I'm always worried there's gonna be somebody out there who's like, you're a fucking asshole telling people to train their joints individually. All you need to do is full range of motion lifts. Like, stop telling people that. Or like I show somebody segmenting their spine and somebody melts down and is like, you never need to do that. If you just play various sports, you'll do everything you need for your spine. So I mean, now since this is all we do for training, I think every single post I have a little voice in the back of my head telling me somebody is going to say something like this. I would say this about this. I mean, this is social media turning me into a crazy person, obviously.
Stepped out into the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, and it's funny too, because like the whole reason we made this podcast was that idea of like all the stuff that we do now. I think probably 90% of the stuff that I post now would be things that prior to learning about this training, I would have been like, look at this fucking idiot. Like, I understand why people have that reaction. If they don't follow me, they just randomly happen upon my page and see me doing some weird stuff. And it's so funny to think that that's the majority of my training now is stuff that would make that, have somebody that have that reaction. It's a wild world. You never know. So now, I mean, what I really like about that is that it's made me far less judgmental about what other people are doing, because you might see, I mean, now I see people doing crazy shit and I at least think like, I wonder why they're doing that. I mean, of course I see stuff out there, especially on, there's big pages with lots of followers and they put stuff out that is dumb information. It's stuff that maybe in my opinion is not really the best way to do that. It doesn't do what they claim it does, though there is a lot of bad shit out there. And if you don't know as much, it's hard to kind of navigate that and determine what is good. Because I mean, that I had this post of doing ballistic isometric where I'm bouncing my shoulder into external rotation. It's hilarious. Like my kids see that. My oldest daughter thinks it's the most ridiculous looking thing in the world. It's so funny and silly looking. So if an 8-year-old feels that way, I totally.
It reminds me of a cat, like when they play with stuff.
Yeah, totally. And so I get why somebody might see that and just be like, oh, this fucking idiot. Look at this dumbass influencer like making shit up. And, going back to what Sarah was saying about like looking at the individual, finding out what they need, and then finding a way to train that specific aspect of what they need doesn't look like an exercise. It looks like some made up shit, because sometimes it is a different thing to be able to target that. And since there's a lot of people out there that are just making shit up for the sake of making shit up, it's hard to differentiate that, I think. So it makes sense why we get these reactions. It's just too bad that I think the worst part is that there's a lot of people that are unwilling to have a dialogue about that, you know, like
or they're unwilling to Google something before they make a nasty comment. That's what's hilarious, because
yeah.
you make up exercises all the time. Like if you're not making up exercises,
you're missing out. You're really missing out. You're stuck in a little box.
Yeah, you need to make stuff up. I mean, that's just kind of like you need to figure out like what your body is capable of so many different things. You have genetic features that are yours specifically that, you know, would be better addressed if you would sit down and think for a few seconds and make some shit up. Like, and that doesn't mean that you're crazy, whimsical, you know, hippie star child, interpretive dancing idiot. Like,
you can do that though if you want. We don't.
Right.
We don't care.
But that's what you get for when you mix up people. It's like, yeah, I can make up an exercise. I didn't make up ballistic isometrics. That's a fucking thing. Like, go ahead and Google that. It's on PubMed. You know, like influencers making it up. It's so funny. Anyways, but it's yeah, you need to read some shit before you make some nasty comments about things, and you need to make up some exercises because that's what you should be doing.
Yeah. Well, we could have a whole podcast on the problems with social media and how easy it is for people to just say things that they would never say to somebody in person because they would get punched in the face. Like that's a whole other topic. That's a problem. But I lost it.
What I was going to say
you go.
is that the only things that now that currently bother me on like that people are saying, like as far as the influencers out there or whatever, I mostly get pissed off when I feel like people are getting ripped off because they're contorting information to make it sound like they have this, you know, product that's gonna be some like big above and beyond kind of a thing, and it's like, this is just some bullshit. Like for example, anybody that's trying to give you an exercise that's going to fix you without assessing you, you know, like that really irks me. Where it's just like, you can't do that to people anymore. You can't say like, just do this thing and it's going to fix your problem. It might fix some people's problem that specifically either were never exercising and just exercising was the solution, or that they specifically actually did need to do that one thing, just so happens. But overall, like, don't ever buy into it. It's just as bad as the whole, like, in 6 weeks you're going to have a six-pack, you know, kind of a thing. Like, maybe
get the splits in 30 days.
If you only needed to lose 3 pounds, like, that or 5 pounds, then maybe that'll be it for you. Yeah, or maybe if you had the splits all your life and then you just needed to like jump back in there for a few weeks and you can get the splits back. But for the most part, all of that like super fast result type stuff, we're going to inject you with a hormone and starve you to death, and you're going to look great in a few weeks, you know. Or yeah, I'm going to fix your XYZ problem with this one exercise. It's just like, don't buy into that shit. That is unfortunately bullshit. It would be awesome if it was true, but it's total BS. That stuff bugs me. And then, you know, it does bug me as well that people still haven't kind of caught on to the whole exercise prerequisite thing, that like these exercises are going to fix everyone, and just keep doing this exercise no matter what's wrong with your hip. And eventually your body will take the form of this exercise and it will fix it, because that's what this hip needs to be doing, is this exercise. It's like a little backwards.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. There's so much stuff on just a squat. Like, if you have a struggle with being in your squat, like, spend time doing an isometric in the bottom of your squat. And, like, there's components of doing an isometric in the bottom of the squat that are beneficial for being able to develop force in the squat. But if you have a hip joint that only has one little chunk of movement available inside that, then that's what you're going to use, and you're never going to get to that other stuff. So it's like your body is an adaptation machine, and it adapts either way. Like, it will just continue to work around that thing that's missing and get better and better at compensating for not having it at the expense of something else. And I think a lot of the time people take that adaptation and they're like, I'm getting better. I feel a little bit better in the bottom of the squat. And you might feel better, but it's still not changing that component of your hip joint, which is hard, because I know there's people out there who are like, well, I just did weighted isometrics in the bottom of the squat and I felt better doing that and I got stronger, and I did. It's like, you did. Well, let's look at how your hip moves still. It's probably still not doing the thing that it's supposed to do. You know, it's hard.
It is.
It's a hard world to navigate out there, and just training alone. We don't have to talk about all the other shit that's going on.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Do you have anything else to say? I don't think I have anything else to say about
that thing that I forgot. I felt like I had a good point to make, but
getting laughed at.
rattling around
random
there.
stuff that we do. But yeah, that's the whole point, is that it's your body should be able to do a vast number of things. Like, look at all the different random sports out there, other odd activities, wild shit you can get up to during sex. Like, there's lots of positions that your body could be inhabiting that aren't going to injure you, but especially if you're trained to do them. Like, if you have goals to do specific sports and things with your body, like, if you train it to do those things won't hurt you. But if you just throw yourself into doing those things thinking that those things are going to make your body better at them, the likelihood of injury is higher. Like, I've said this over and over in some posts, but it's like, delicately, like, work around the best way to train yourself, like, in a stepwise way. Like, you don't just go with loading, and a lot of those exercises are loading, and there's no way around it. Like, you have to load to get into those positions, and it's a lot of load. Like, that's not necessarily the best place to start. Like, trying to do a back bend for somebody that's got no spine extension isn't the best place to start for a back bend. But you can get there. You can train yourself to do that stuff.
Yeah, I see a lot of that out there of, like, if you have trouble getting in this position, add some weight and you'll get in the position. It's like, of course that works, Like, if you can't crush a can that's pressurized and full of liquid, if you run it over with your fucking car, it's going to break it and pop it. Like, it's kind of the same idea. It doesn't mean that it's better, though, just because it's putting you into that position. It doesn't mean that you're actually getting the adaptation that you want out of it.
Like someone who can't squat without a bar, like, and then 135 pounds suddenly fixes all their problems. And it's basically just because it's a passive, like, they don't actively have that position. They need lots of passive resistance that kind of pushes them into, they need something to be able to push against to flatten their back.
Totally. If I put my shoulder in external rotation here, well, that's as far as it goes. But if Sarah reaches over here and pushes on my arm really hard, she'll be able to make it go past that. And that doesn't mean that that's a better position for my shoulder to be in. It just means that she's now stretching my internal rotators more. And that's it. That's not it's not fixing my external rotation. I have to do more stuff than that to be able to use it. It's loaded stretching.
Yeah, like if Grayson needs more of this, and so one option is to have some exercise where there's a lot of heavy weight pulling his arm back this way. He could do that, and that will eventually develop more external rotation. Or he could do some passive stretching and isometrics, which is a safer way. You can grade the loading. You can make the isometrics starting light. You can be more specific and slower about where you're feeling something. So if you're having closing angle pinching stuff happening, a lot of times loading this, you're not paying attention to that. Like, you're too far down the road. You'll get there. Like, you don't need to be there if it's going to hurt you. Like, walk your way up to that, then load it. That's the thing. Is it's like, develop the position smartly, use the best tools available. The whole, you don't have to stretch. You don't have to stretch. You don't have to stretch, but it's fucking better to stretch. It's like,
your tissue does need to stretch. It's a
works.
Quality that
it does
needs to
things.
happen.
It does other things, and it's doing more. We're realizing, because that's the other thing too. Is a lot of people say it doesn't do anything. It actually, we're finding out, does do something. It does do a lot more than we thought that it did.
But even if we don't look at the new developments that they're finding out about passive stretching, it's like they say you don't need to stretch, but that's a really silly thing to say, because your tissue does have to stretch for you to move. You need to passively able to move. Like, a lot of the time they're saying that because they're not thinking about maybe those end ranges of flexibility that they might not be using. But if all of a sudden, like, if I just push my arm straight, that's passively flexing or extending my elbow. Like, if I all of a sudden had stopped my ability of that tissue just to passively stretch, and I just went like this and my fucking elbow stopped extending there.
Well, I think that they mean sitting in a passive stretch. Like, they don't mean going through end range.
No, I know, but I'm just saying, like, it's just,
right.
It's like that, like, without passive flexibility, you can't do anything else on top of that. If you don't have passive flexibility, you need that component to be able to train it to get stronger and load it and do all of this shit. So it's like, you can't say that any of this stuff is unnecessary. Like, going back to the shoulder external rotation thing, and when we're choosing to apply these inputs, there's a timeline that is optimal, that works the best. Like, if you don't have great external rotation, my first thing wouldn't be to put you in a position and have you slam your shoulder repeatedly with band tension into external rotation really fast, because your shoulder's probably not ready to do that. There's lower intensity options where we can build those qualities up to do that. But you can't ever say that this isn't something that isn't important to have, because what causes the shoulder dislocation is commonly somebody getting their shoulder slammed into external rotation quickly, and it can't resist that force and it gets dislocated. So training your tissue to be able to tolerate that is a really valuable thing at the right time. But again, it's just, back to that, like, you need a lot of information when you see something to be able to judge if it's good or bad or if they shouldn't be doing it. You need like a whole fucking storyline. You need longer than a 90-second reel probably to be able to figure out why they're doing that and why it's important. Otherwise, you're probably making a bad decision about it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things I could look at and say, ooh, I don't know about that. Like hinge point spine stuff. Like I see a lot of contortionist yogi folks where they have an immense amount of spine extension in like one vertebrae, and it's like, what the fuck? Like their back is flat. It's like
lumbar extension.
But who knows? Maybe they've really trained that one vertebrae very well, and it's not going to bother them at any point. Who knows? But
they have. But that's a really good example of like people who use that a lot. But if they're not thinking about how they're training their spine and they're just good at spine extension, their body just goes to the default of where it moves the most, and it keeps repeatedly loading that. It's the same reason why if your hip joint sucks and you keep squatting, your hip joint doesn't get better as far as like that missing internal rotation, because it just skips over that part that it can't use and uses the parts that it can. And that's why another component of this and the questions that we get a lot from when we're training people is like, well, I trained my shoulder internal rotation and it's a lot better now. Like, well, is there a time where I don't need to train shoulder internal rotation anymore? And the answer always comes back as no. You may train it less frequently in different amounts or different intensities, but all of this stuff, since your body's constantly adapting to all of the force and all of the movement that you're doing, if there's one thing that you need, I mean, we need shoulder internal rotation. There's no point in your life where you're not going to need shoulder internal rotation, but if you never use shoulder internal rotation enough, it goes away. So a lot of this stuff too is kind of continually being trained no matter what, no matter how good you get at shoulder internal rotation. You need to keep training that with some frequency so you can maintain that quality, because just going back to doing all the old stuff that you were doing isn't enough to keep that.
And I think people have like genetic kind of setups, like people are born with short or longer hamstrings. There are people that have tighter capsules than others, and like that's, if you it's always going to come back like that thing. If you are naturally tight in a certain scenario, like you're going to have to just constantly work that position or it will go away fast.
It will. I mean, and it's interesting too, just looking at the wide variety of people, because you can have a few people who all have what looks like a very similar amount of internal rotation, or maybe they have both external and internal. And so if you're looking only, say, range of motion, you're like, you're good, but like your shoulder hurts when you do this exercise and you two do the same exercise and that feels fine. So there's all these other components, like going back to the passive flexibility thing, like, do you have the passive flexibility to get your joint there? Can you actually control it there individually without moving a whole bunch of other joints? Can you then load that position? Can you load it at a high intensity? Like, those are all things that need to be checked off before.
Do you get a weird nerve twinge when you're coming through here? Do you feel it on the wrong side of the shoulder? Like, there's a lot of information to gather basically about, a position.
Yeah. Where do you feel it when you load it? Like, if you load your shoulder's internal rotation, do you get a funky pinching sensation in the front, or do you just feel a nice stretch in the posterior shoulder? Like,
yeah.
You could have shoulders that look and move very similarly, but they respond drastically differently to loading. And all of that stuff is part of that thing that's going to dictate what your training should be like.
Right, and what exercises are good for you or bad for you. And, like, we don't ever recommend avoiding stuff. Like, that's the other thing is I've heard this on a certain super popular Instagram thing that annoyed me. This one annoyed me, where it was like, this guy's got a ton of range of motion, and he has closing angle pain in the sleeper stretch. So the solution was for this person to just never ever fucking go in that position again. It's like, really, like, just completely avoid shoulder internal rotation. It's like,
totally, but that's advice that people are getting about their back. They're like, man, every time you hurt your back when you flex your spine, like, this is a repeated thing. You just really need to stop flexing your spine. Brings up another thing. There was this article that was in the New York Times a few weeks ago. This orthopedic surgeon shared it on Twitter, and a friend sent it to me. But he was basically just saying, like, he hates this kind of stuff because it spreads fear. And so this article was from, I don't remember what their background was. The biology, biomechanics, like, obviously very smart, educated person wrote this long article in the New York Times about why the knee joint has evolved to be inherently fragile. and they talked about just how much movement there is in the knee joint and how it's all supported by connective tissue and how that is inherently, it's an inherent vice. Like it's just a weak thing that's waiting to break. And it's crazy because there's a lot of smart people out there that are putting that kind of information out there to get really the solution was like, we're just trying to educate you on how your knee joint actually is. It's fucking delicate. So the best thing that you can do is try to be careful in your life with your knees. And it's so funny because they have good intentions, like they're trying to help people from hurting their knees, but like the very message that they're sending is the thing that actually makes people's knee joints more fragile. Because connective tissue, if it's trained and it works like it's supposed to, is fucking strong. Like it's ridiculously strong. Your Achilles tendon, tension-wise, it can hold like 5,000 pounds of force. It's like, that's stronger than lots of the metals that we use to support big buildings and bridges and stuff. When it doesn't get used enough and it's not loaded regularly and it's misbehaving connective tissue, it is weak and it's fragile. But that doesn't have anything to do with like your fear or not. You know, that's not part of it. Like you can make those things really strong. And so it's this thing about like our anatomy is inherently fragile and it's not. But there's a lot of people putting that out there and it's so fucking frustrating.
It kind of reminds me of those posts that do crack me up about nutrition, where it's like some guy that's going to eat something and then somebody comes in and tells him like, oh, this is bad now, and then he goes over here and then that's bad and everything is bad and you can't eat anything anymore. Whether it's like through the decades how things have changed or just now, like there's so many warring camps where things are just so off the table. And it's the same thing with exercise. I think people start to get to a point where they're just like hopping in a circle on one leg, like what am I allowed to do? Like, can't do this,
it's hard.
Can't
there's
do that.
There's so much information out there.
Yep.
And that's one of the reasons why people see the stuff that we put out and lots of our fellow FRC people, and they're like, oh, that's fucking bullshit just like all the other stuff. You know, like, it's frustrating. It's got to be frustrating. Like, there's way more out there now than there was when we first started doing this stuff. Yep. And it was overwhelming then. So, I mean, it just seems like it just gets more and more overwhelming. So, you know, this comes back to the thing that we always talk about of, like, there's no room for nuance anymore. And so unless you can really capture somebody's attention and they can stick with you for a while, it's hard to get the message out there on.
Yeah, and we're particularly fond of that functional range systems approach. It's not the only way to do something, you know, it's not the end all be all. There's definitely other ways to train tissue that work well for a lot of people, but it always does have to come down to really assessing, like, however you do that assessment, like you're looking at like what this person has and doesn't have and then how to make it better and being creative about it. And those are really the best trainers of any system, of any ilk, are people that are functionally intelligent, that it can think about a moving body and like, what does this body need? How do I input that into that body? And I think that it just kind of shows like less experience when people get really judgy about like the successes that all of the different types of movement can have with a person. Again, it's all about like, what's the process? How did they get there? Like, are they prepared to do the thing that they're doing? How have they prepared to do it? I mean, there'd be sports stuff like dance and gymnastics and all of the really weird things that people can do with their bodies. Like, they've been training since little kids, and yeah, a lot of them are completely beat up by the end of it, but they have developed a system to get these people to this point.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's that whole issue, though, that, I mean, people will make that argument now. Like, another thing when you ask me, what am I afraid of people commenting on, you know, I've had a lot of negative feedback on talking about following the internal strength model and doing this very low volume approach for hypertrophy, like where you're doing one set to failure. And there's been people out there with big names who've done really well with it, but a lot of the research out there, you know, still shows like you got to do this much volume, whatever. And so people will be like, oh, you're just going to ignore all of the research articles that show that actually this many sets and reps is what gets hypertrophy. And so it's not like the stuff that's been done doesn't work. Like, I lifted weights in the classic form for a long time and I got really strong for me, and it works. It's not that it doesn't work. It's just, I think it just comes down to the, like, what's going to let you do the thing that you want to do for a long time and not fall apart.
Well, what's really interesting to me, though, about that is that, like, yes, you know, like that many sets, like, we're aware of that research. It's not like we're not aware of that shit. That's what we were doing before we did the ISM. And we did the ISM and I was like, oh, really? really? I mean, it makes sense. Like, you know, do the input. Did you hit the input? Did you hit the right exact stimulus?
Did you hit the
What's
intensity?
going to allow you to hit the stimulus is that you're ready to go, you know, and that just makes sense. Like, it makes sense. You're ready to go. Because it used to be just throw a bunch of stuff at somebody until they're overwhelmed and hope they don't catch a cold and like fall apart, you know, like you're like riding this fragile line of you can handle it. But it looks worse. Like things look like they're getting worse for a while. Like it'll kind of do this wave, but you expect that. But then when you kind of pull that out and you see all this progress anyway without all that volume, and you're like, why was I doing all that? That's the thing that's funny is like you would think that it would be such a dramatically worse improvement, you know, or way less worse results to take somebody through that. I mean, I don't think that somebody that has worked with Westside Barbell and these guys that have, you know, doctor's degrees and are as intelligent and experienced as they are, I don't think that they would put out a certification without having tested it. You know, like they're not going to just go, oh yeah, this should work. Let's just tell everybody this and then hope it works. Like it works. Like we've played with it, and it doesn't take long to figure out that it does work. You don't
It
have
totally
to beat
works.
yourself up.
You don't. Yeah, I mean, you can only train so many people and have them experience the same results before. I mean, it's one thing with your own body, especially if you train a lot and you're really aware of what your body's doing. Like you'll know if something's working or it's not working. But when you start being able to train a lot of other people from really wide backgrounds and experience with training and have them all experience the same results of getting stronger and getting bigger muscles and resolving their joint issues and doing the activities that they had avoided for so long because shit hurt, you're like, find me something else out there that does that and I'll buy into it. But at this point, we
and
haven't been exposed to
bitches
anything.
about it. That's the funny thing is all the people that have done the other system. Like you start to throw this at them, and they all will within a week to a day or two of seeing the program go, they get insecure. They're like, this isn't going to work. There's no way this is going to work. Like this is just too little volume. Can I throw some extra sets in here and there? And I'm like, you can, but no, you can't really. Like it's not going to help.
Doesn't
you.
work the
It's
same.
make it worse. Like that's what I'm trying to tell you. Like there's a reason why I've only trashed that tissue once this week because I want it to recover to be ready to go again. But if you just pile a bunch of extra shit onto it, it's not going to be the same thing. And then down the road, they all go, yeah, this is amazing. It works. I'm getting stronger and PRing. You know, like Josh had a really great deadlift PR and he's a busy dad and working, but like he's seeing really steady progress, but he's able to do it and it's not tearing up his body. And that's what we get a lot also is that like I'm seeing progress just like I was with the other stuff, but I feel way better. Like I'm not in pain. All of my shit feels good. Like things that were bothering me are resolving. Like it's just a much more sustainable way of doing things, you know?
It is. I mean, when I have new clients, especially ones that have done a lot of the classic model of training, I tell them the same thing in the beginning, like, let's stick with these things and let's do that for a little bit and see what happens. Because the easiest thing to do to somebody that you're training is to give them too much shit to do. That is the easiest thing you can do as a trainer is just give them a whole lot of stuff so it's a bloodbath that they're crawling out of every workout session and they're sore as fuck. And I mean, I bought into that back in the day. I was like, that's a good workout. If you're fucking crushed and you're sore as shit the next time you train, you probably got a good workout in. And it turns out that that's a sign that you got way more than you needed, because what you actually need when you're doing it at the right amount, you're not crushed, you're not really, really sore, you're actually ready to go back and perform well. And if you're not ready to perform well the next time you do that thing, you probably didn't give yourself enough time before you did it again. Like the amount of shit that you need to do to create the adaptation that you want when you're doing the right amount of stuff is shockingly minimal.
Well, it's also like the funny thing to me too is it's like it's not like you're marrying something and you know unable to ever change it again. Like if you're not seeing the results, if you suddenly start shrinking or getting weaker, heaven forbid, all you got to do is tweak the intensity and tweak the time a little bit, tweak the exposures. That's all you have to do. You don't have to jump from what you're doing to go back to 10 sets per muscle group per week. You don't have to do that. You just, what's going on here? Why isn't this working? And oftentimes it's because people aren't hitting the intensity that they're being asked to hit. Sneaky little people. I get that all the time where it's like, are you going to failure? Well, no. Well, that's why, you know, like it's not working. That's the point of this. Like if you're not hitting the duration and intensity right, you're not hitting the stimulus. If you're not hitting the stimulus, you shouldn't be expecting it to be optimal. But just tweak it a little bit. If you are hitting the stimulus and you're not seeing, then you particularly might need a little bit more. But you don't have to go all the way to 10 sets. Walk it in there. Like, figure out exactly what works specifically better for you, because again, people are different.
Yeah, and another component of that too, like I know when I post, I like sharing the muscular work that I do on social media, because I think that's the thing that people are used to seeing. So I like to show, like, here's a different way that you can do this stuff. But I'll get people who are like, oh, that's sweet, I want to do that thing, I'm going to try that out. And I just don't have time to go into the comments and have these long discussions. But a lot of the time I want to say, like, I love that you want to do this, but really the way that this one set to failure works the best is because I'm doing all of this other shit leading up to that, where I'm training my hip joint and my knee joint and making sure those parts are working well so I can access all of that tissue that I want when I do my squat. Like, I would imagine you could get muscular growth doing one set to failure, but if you're not doing all of that other joint and tissue specific stuff, you're not optimizing what you're going to get out of that one set to failure. So I think that's another component that's really important, is like, if you want to do this super minimal muscular work and get good progress, you have to be doing that on parts that are working well. And the only way to get those parts working well is to really figure out where they are right now and then train them, train that shit that's missing. And I think it's easy to see that, because, like, I know if I didn't know about this whole model of training, I would just see that, like, oh wait, like, I can just do one set of squats instead of doing all these squats. Well, that's cool. I'll just start doing one set of squats, but maybe I'm not doing all of the other stuff that I need to do.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're not going to get those results.
Because it's like, explain Dorian Yates. Like, he did one set a week, and people are like, oh, we're on drugs. They're all on drugs though. Like, they're all fucking on drugs. So they all look the same. Some guys are in there, going like Ronnie Coleman, and then the other guys are going like Dorian Yates, and it's like, it's
Something's
working,
different.
Like, where's the research there? I don't know. It would be interesting. It would really be interesting to figure that out. But
the one thing about
our N equals 1 is that it works really well.
Yeah. I mean, even I was just thinking about this the other day, like the body, this is especially targeted for like bodybuilders or people who are just really interested in like very specifically changing the way that these parts are physically. Like, if you look at a classic bodybuilder program and all of the different angles that they're trying to work through to target different aspects of tissue for growth, you think about the joint specific method. Like, if you were really following that joint specific method and your only goal was hypertrophy, like, when you isolate one joint and you move it through its full range of motion, and say you get to the point where you're able to do that at a really high intensity with lots of weight, and you're taking that movement to failure, that is going to target all of that shit that you're trying to get to by just trying to work through these 5 different angles of different horizontal pressing. It's interesting in that aspect too. Like, it'd be really fun to get somebody who's like, I'm a bodybuilder and I'm competitive, but I'm down to try this totally different way of training, and really have somebody work through that and like start.
I think John Quint has done that.
Well, John Quint is doing it. Yeah, I know. John Quint, we want to see more of that stuff. You're probably not watching this, but I know I would love to see more of your training.
Waste more of your time posting Instagram, buddy. Come on.
Yeah, right. But yeah, I mean, I just thinking about like some of the stuff that I've noticed has gotten bigger, and I realize like probably a lot of that is, it's not just because I'm doing way less muscular work, but I'm also like really pushing how much I can just internally and externally rotate, or how much I can do on a shoulder car.
They've also talked about that quite a bit, I think, both Spina and Quint, where they just kind of say like, you can't move where you can't move, and you can't train shit that you can't move. So if you give yourself more access to more tissue with more movement, then you start seeing more stuff. So
that's it.
Yeah.
That's the one.
That explains your lats.
That's right. Finally. Well, anyway, I think that's all I got.
Yeah. Hope you guys stuck with this one. Sorry, it was very rambly, but
that's why it's the most unofficial podcast ever. What do we say? Most something podcast? What is it?
I don't know. It's like the Dumb and Dumber version, or spontaneous.
Spontaneous.
Super spontaneous. It's just us talking. We talk about this crap all the time, so we figured we should film it. And if any of you nice people that happen to watch it enjoy it, great. Otherwise, stop watching.
Yeah, totally. Just
Thank
hit that
you
pause
anyway,
button.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye.